fortunate to have spent my entire life actually on the leading edge of science and technology, having grown up in a family where my father was quite a brilliant scientist, and we had labs in our basement from the time I was a child. And throughout my career, I have circulated among leading edge scientists around the world, and been involved really with technology, as I say, all my life, having created a company at one time in the past that created some 3,500 patents in its field, and licensed and joint ventured what became approximately $400 million worth of transactions in the licensing and commercialization of technologies. So it's been quite a journey. One of the things which I've come to experience over the years is to appreciate the widening gap between what's known today on the leading edge of science and technology and what's known by the public, unfortunately, about what's known in science and technology. That is, that gap has never been as wide in my lifetime as it is right now. And many of us at the leading edge of science and technology have come to understand the basis of quite a different paradigm, a very, very different paradigm than what's widely known and widely taught. And many of us have mused over the question of how do you fix this problem when mainstream science is still teaching a paradigm that turns out to be quite flawed, and every educational institution on the face of the earth is still teaching a great deal of science that turns out to be incorrect relative to what we now know at the leading edge of science and technology. And some of us concluded that the way that you fix that is not by trying to change the mainstream scientific view, which in the lamenting words of Max Planck, the famous physicist, that group changes, quote, one funeral at a time, unquote. But you change it by introducing technologies into the society that are based on a different understanding, in this case, quite a different paradigm than is widely taught. And by its adoption, it becomes common knowledge in the society that, in fact, there is a different paradigm. And the mainstream scientific community is usually actually the last to come along and finally admit that, in fact, the emperor has no clothes. According to classical physics, there are only 5 fields. That is, there are only 5 circumstances where you can create a distant influence on something by virtue of a field phenomenon. And those fields are well known in classical science as electric fields, magnetic fields, gravitational fields, and so-called strong and weak nuclear attraction fields. According to classical physics, that's all there are. Well, Russian physicists, particularly a physicist by the name of Akimov, and numerous others in the former Soviet Union, came to realize that there's a 6th fundamental type of field with different properties than all of the rest, and that this field is in fact literally comprised of information. That is, it doesn't actually have any presence in this dimension physically, but it can create effects in this dimension, and that the field itself is literally comprised of information. Well, trying to wrap your mind around a field that is made of information is a little difficult, but said differently, in the case of the human aura, it's essentially a field of thought forms or ideas, or as I said differently, information. But it's a non-physical field, but don't think for a minute that that doesn't have any significance in this dimension. Turns out the Russians discovered that it has huge significance in this dimension. First of all, they were the first to understand in detail what the nature of those fields was, and that those fields, in fact, had a non-local property attached to them. That is, unlike all other fields which follow the so-called inverse square law, where they're getting weaker as you move away from the source by the square of the distance, in the case of information fields, the Soviets found that if you knew how to do it, you could put information into the universe anywhere in the universe and take it out virtually instantaneously anywhere else. That is, these fields had a non-local property. They were not something that you could only consider only existed in one locality. Secondly, they had a property very different from electric and magnetic fields where opposites attract, where in information fields, like attracts like, the opposite property, where like aspects will attract each other. And they demonstrated that by a variety of experiments in physics, including projecting an information field on laser beams, for example, such that you spin polarize the light in the laser beam similarly by virtue of both being hit with the same information field, and noticing that the beams would actually bend toward each other, or if they were oppositely polarized, that they would diverge. The Soviets also found that these fields had a unique property in that they could condition space. That is, the longer you projected an information field into a given physical locality, the more that locality would literally take on the characteristic of that particular type of information field, that the space became conditioned. Excuse me. Additionally, they discovered that these fields had something called torsional properties. That is, they had sort of a right-handedness and a left-handedness to them. They also found that various forms of energy by projecting information fields on some energy manifestation. They could even cause the physical manifestation of energy altogether in this dimension, or cause its demanifestation in this dimension, which was really what was happening when Valerie Hunt was measuring these layers in the human aura. She was measuring electromagnetic effects, but what she was measuring was an electromagnetic effect that was being created by that field. It wasn't what the field was, it's just that the field could, in fact, cause the manifestation of electromagnetic effects. Similarly, these fields could cause effects in changing the properties of matter, that you could literally change the physical properties of matter by projecting information fields under certain circumstances. It turns out that not only does consciousness create an information field, and the consciousness of every living being create an information field that surrounds its physical presence, but there are other ways which the Soviets discovered could also create information fields, which were of the same nature and character, but being created by physical means. For example, there are certain geometries which will, as a matter of fact, any geometry will, in fact, by virtue of its existence as a geometry, create an information field associated with that geometry. Now, there are certain classes of geometry which, in ancient times, were known and have become described in modern times as, quote, sacred geometries. That it turns out when you create those geometries out of anything, it doesn't matter whether it's paper, metal, wood, etc., the very act of creating that geometry will, in fact, create the establishment of an information field. Well, as I've told you, any object will create an information field by virtue of its geometry, but the difference with a sacred geometry, so to speak, the so-called sacred geometries, which include all the Platonic solids, for example, among other things, is that when you create those geometries, they not only create an information field, they create one that has a property called coherence. And we'll come back to that in a while. It turns out that any rotating body will, in fact, create the existence of an information field. Any vibrating body will create the existence of an information field. Any changing magnetic field will create an informational field component. And all electromagnetic signals will, by virtue of their oscillation, as frequency oscillations, create an information field as well. So there are quite a few ways in which information fields are created in the world. There are numerous examples of naturally generated information fields, such as the sun. In fact, in the solar system, is the largest it's the most intensive generator of an information field in the solar system. Not too surprising, since I've told you certain geometries, which include spheres, will create information fields. Rotation will create them, the sun rotates. Electromagnetic energy will create them, and the sun is, of course, a huge producer of electromagnetic energy, et cetera, et cetera. The moon also creates information fields. Trees and plants all create information fields. Human beings, animals, all living beings do. Insect nests, by virtue of their geometries, turn out to create information fields. And there are geological information fields that occur by virtue of circulation of magma in the earth. There are so-called geopathic information fields that will be perceived as being disharmonious, that are being created by so-called geopathic stress in the earth. Actually, there are a number of anomalous places. Some of you may have visited them where they're tourist attractions, where they've noticed gravitational anomalies and what they regard as optical illusions, which in fact turn out to be more than that, where you can have, for example, two people stand in different positions that are of the same height. One will look taller and the other will look shorter, and you reverse them, and now, the opposite is true. Interestingly, if you study those places, there's one in Oregon, there's one in California, there's one in North Carolina, you'll find that animals will refuse to go in those places. You won't find any animals other than man who pays to go in those places, going in those areas of geopathic stress. This is a synthetic, a device developed originally by the Russians, one form of it. You're looking at the inside of an information field generator that can synthetically generate information fields. Kind of a strange looking device. The Soviets, as I say, were the first to understand these fields in a great deal of depth in this whole area of science in a great deal of depth. And literally spent 500 million rubles of the Ministry of Defense of the former Soviet Union in pursuit of the science and technologies surrounding this area of study, initially obviously focused on military applications. They developed communication technologies which are faster than the speed of light and are not line of sight limited. For example, you could literally communicate with something that was behind the sun, whereas with any kind of radio technology, you would be limited by both the speed of light, and you couldn't communicate with it until it came out from being screened by the sun. Not so with information field technology. They developed satellite-based prospecting technology, where using satellite images that detected the information fields of ore deposits, petroleum deposits, things like that in the earth, and then processing those images using their knowledge of information field technology, they could tell you essentially where any kind of ore deposit or petroleum deposit was in the face of the earth via satellite prospecting. They didn't have to go dig it up, which is quite an amazing piece of technology. They developed materials processing technologies where they could change the properties of materials, change, for example, the corrosion resistance of metals, change the toughness and strength of metals, change the crystallographic structure of materials by virtue of information field technology utilized during the processing of those materials. So these were not just academic exercises. These were real technologies that had very, very powerful implications. The first piece of technology developed in the former Soviet Union for imaging in some way the so-called human aura, or the information field that surrounds living beings, was discovered by a husband and wife team named Curlian, in which they found that using contact photography, that they could take a photographic plate and, for example, put a freshly picked leaf on it, or put your hand on it, or something like that, in an electric field, and the interaction between the information field surrounding the living object and the electric field would actually cause them to be able to photograph that field in a contact print. And there's a fairly famous photograph, for example, of a freshly picked leaf, where they did that and they photographed the field around the leaf. And then they took the leaf, cut it in half, photographed it again, and now you see again the photograph of the leaf itself and the field around it. But you see the complete field as though it were around the whole leaf, even though only half the leaf is there, which is quite interesting, that the information field surrounding the leaf still survived the destruction, physical destruction of half the leaf in the beginning. What you're looking at here on the screen is actually the computer output on the right-hand side of the screen, upper three images, of the information field surrounding a living being, which is being detected by a device called a GDV, which was developed by Dr. Konstantin Korotkov in the 1990s. And what this used was the phenomenon of Kirlian photography, but not using actually a photographic process, but using a glow discharge detector in which you would put your fingers adjacent to the detector, which is why you see these 10 fingerprints there, the aura around the person's fingerprints, and using a computer algorithm and the fact that the human aura turns out to be holographic, they could then project what the human aura looked like around the entire being. And what you're looking at in the upper series of three pictures of the aura surrounding a person is the person in one mental state, and then in the lower picture, you're looking at the person having intentionally changed his mental state. And you're looking at the changes in the person's aura. That this aura really is a field of thought forms. Now, frankly, for the average person to make such a change in their aura would not be possible. Most people can't make such an extreme change, but this man was a trained, what's called a Qigong master, who was expert in the area of what is called energy healing. I've taught for centuries secretly in China, and only recently being started to be taught publicly. And so this man has an enormous ability to literally change his field and control all of his physical and mental processes. But anyway, it's a real example of the fact that that aura is in fact a product of consciousness. The Soviets, as I say, were the first to really understand the nature of the aura, which now the National Institute of Health in this country calls the human biofield. The field is literally comprised of information. There's nothing physical in it. And the information is being instantaneously and continuously generated by the consciousness of the individual. The primary inputs to that field come from the person's rational or waking consciousness and their subconscious. It turns out the most important elements come from the person's subconscious, because those tend to go into that field and stay there on an extended basis, whereas the inputs from the waking or rational consciousness tend to be transients, and they tend to come and go. People who can see the human aura, and as it turns out, any of you who can't see it may be interested to know you can be trained to see it, and there are techniques for learning to see it. Anyone who can see it will tell you that if a person becomes angry, that they can see flashes of vitiated red in the person's field. They'll perceive the field as colors, even though, as I say, it doesn't have any existence in this dimension and it isn't physically constituted of light in this dimension, but they'll perceive it that way. If they're lying to you, they'll see sort of a muddy green come into their aura. And so obviously it has some advantage to be able to see somebody's aura, because you can tell a lot about what's going on in their consciousness. It turns out that this field is in fact extremely important in the fact that it is the medium of communication between the person's consciousness and literally every cell in their body. And this turns out to explain a lot, which was, even in recent times, is still unexplained in biological science, as to, in fact, how cells know to become what they become. That is, we all start off our physical presence as a single cell enterprise, which then, of course, as we all know, divides and differentiates and becomes hair, blood, bones, etc., and we physically grow our physical body. But still today, cellular biologists cannot explain to you how your physical body gets here. How do those cells know to become an eyelid instead of an eyelash, or a fingernail instead of a fingerprint? How do they know when to stop one thing and become another, and all of that? For a while, people used to, wave their arms saying, oh, well, it's genetics or DNA or whatever. And the more that people learn, the more difficult it was to explain, because the genetics and DNA are the same in every cell. So that doesn't explain cellular differentiation. Well, it turns out that where the knowledge comes from to direct those cells is something that you come into this dimension with and exists in your consciousness. And for those of you who have been taught, as all of us have been taught, that consciousness is a product of the brain, I have to tell you there's a considerable body of science today that will tell you consciousness is not a product of the brain, it's the other way around. The brain is a product of consciousness. And while it is true that if you see brain activity, that something is going on in consciousness, the reverse is not true, that if you don't see brain activity, nothing is going on in consciousness. And that turns out not to be true. So anyway, all of us actually have, at a certain level of consciousness, the knowledge by which we literally direct the whole orchestra of every cell in our bodies to literally create our physical body. So that's the whole phenomenon of how cells differentiate begins to be explained for the first time by the understanding of information fields as being the medium by which you literally can communicate continuously with all those cells in your body. As I indicated earlier, the Soviets found that if you knew how to do it, you could input information anywhere in the universe and take it out anywhere else instantaneously. Now, the knew how to do it actually turns out to relate to something called addressing methods.